I really do want to thank you for the privilege of speaking once again at a chaplaincy conference. And I mean once again in the sense that 2 years ago I was invited to speak, and it was actually my first speaking engagement as moderator. So I have very clear memories of it. And there was at least one other person who also said they remembered even what I said then, which was most amazing, because I have a vague memory of it. Actually, on that occasion, my chosen topic was more than being there, and addressed the holistic nature of chaplaincy as including pastoral care, mission, and social justice. But it really is a privilege to be able to come back and to be able to spend most of the time of this conference with you. And I truly say, the bits I've missed, I've really missed. And so thank you for your hospitality. I've had sort of this image of this conference as being like a blank canvas on which people have started to paint pictures. David Tacey, of course, started, and he painted a big one right in the middle. And then others have added the colours and shapes. Christine and Rosemary and Gary and Peter and Joseph have presented their contributions to the canvas, others through worship, through the organisation, through the skits and presentations. Everyone has played a part in putting something on the canvas. And one of the daunting parts of being last speaker is, there are a few gaps left on the canvas, but you've got to kind of make it blend in somehow. Anyhow, it's my joy to attempt that. When Peter approached me to speak on the topic of dancing in the gap, my first question was, where do I start? I answered my own question with an instinctive reaction, which was, go to the lectionary. Go to the lectionary. By the way, I don't think that when David Tacey asked the question, what do Protestants have to offer to spirituality and mysticism? And we all kind of sat there in stunned silence. I wish I'd thought of saying, we offer our serious engagement with the scriptures. Surely that's part of it. And I was in the fortunate position of speaking midweek. I had 2 Sundays to go to and to choose from. And this is what I came up with. And this is what the lectionary came up with, and this is what I chose. Jeremiah 29, verse 1. These are the words of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining elders among the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. And then from verse 4, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles who I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. It's always addressed to the men, isn't it? Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Linking that passage with my own experience of ministry and of chaplaincy in particular, I came up with this. Dancing in the gap, doing chaplaincy and pastoral care in exile space. The crux of the issue is this. The person with whom the chaplain or pastoral carer is ministering is nearly always not on their home turf. They're either in hospital, a mental health facility, in jail, in a nursing home, in a seaman's mission, in a workplace, or at school. Furthermore, they are often there due to some crisis in their lives. The stay in the new place is often medium to long term, often not of their choosing, and perhaps without a prospect of return to their formerly normal place. No going home in the temporal sense. And so they are challenged with coming to terms with the new normal. The gap can therefore be seen as a gap of homelessness, a place of loneliness and disorientation without clear and recognisable bearings. Rosemary spoke of the isolation and estrangement of mental health patients and reported the fact that up to 70% never receive a visitor, and that the chaplains too sometimes feel this homelessness. So what is the nature of this exile space? For the people of Israel and Judah who experienced exile from their homeland, and in particular in the Babylonian exile that came to a head in 587 BC, a major dynamic was their enforced separation from two key aspects of their lives. They lost their king, and they lost contact with their temple. Two major props of their lives were gone. The king had provided them with temporal security. He was someone who could tell you what to do, keep you safe from marauders, and punish you if you displeased him. In exile, in the gap left by the absent king, those people were suddenly thrown back on their own resources for survival. And what was worse, now getting pushed around by someone else who didn't even have an upside. And then in losing the temple, they lost their sense of knowing where God was located. For in that time, in that religious space, the view of the majority of the powers was that God was located in that Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies of the temple. So you always knew where God was. And they lost the structure of their religion, which provided a way of being reconciled to God. I'm not saying all that is theologically correct. I'm simply saying that's the way it was for them. I thought about this when Joseph presented insights on the spirituality of dwelling and the spirituality of seeking. The journey into exile is, at least initially, a crisis of the loss of dwelling and structure, which places extra demands on courage in seeking other resources on new and risky paths. In a very real way, the pastoral care worker, the chaplain, is part of this journey of exile and seeking new ways of spiritual engagement. The ministry of the chaplain is nearly always done on someone else's turf, ministering in the gap. It's not done at home, a luxury reserved for the congregational minister. As a chaplain, you keep turning up and taking responsibility until the place of exile starts to feel like home. So I want to link that idea, that biblical idea of exile now with some of my own experience and share it with you. My 7-year period away from congregational ministry, from 1993 to the year 2000, had very strong resonances of exile. Facing a major life crisis, my church effectively suggested that I go and bleed somewhere else for a while. Sometimes, as hard as it is, that is the way it actually has to be. It was very interesting that in that time, other churches, other denominations provided a lot of the healing space. My exile journey led me from a bit of taxi driving through 18 months of adolescent and family counselling in Campbelltown to a 5-year industrial chaplaincy at the BHP Steelworks in Newcastle. Now, for someone who gets high blood pressure going into Bunnings, this was alien space indeed. I don't have time to tell you more. It also became an alien space for the workers when the closure of the plant was announced with 2.5 years' notice, with the threat of exile of the whole workforce, 3,400 people. From my own experience of moving into that kind of alien space, that exile journey, my observation is that chaplains, pastoral care workers, fit somewhere along a spectrum between what I would call the walking wounded and the naturals, those quintessential career chaplains. At this end of the spectrum is the fellow I read about who, as a new industrial chaplain, drove one day to the worksite to go for a visit, sat in his car for 6 hours reading the newspaper, and drove home. I identify with that man. It takes courage to be in ministry on someone else's turf, in alien space, and sometimes our courage fails us. At the other end of the spectrum are those such as the chief naval chaplains I observed recently at the Fleet Review Service. Big men in uniform of office and chest bemedalled. They seem totally at home in that space, even walking with a confident swagger. And I'm not saying that derogatorily or critically, I'm simply saying what I observed. I admire our forces chaplains doing a job that I could never do. They seem to be more in that the naturals. It's a generalisation, but I wonder where you see yourself on that spectrum. Maybe it'd be instructive to think about that. For me, as an industrial chaplain, this was not a natural fit. But this is where I am sure God had called me to be, as much for my own sake as for anyone else. For God works with long vision. God uses chaplains and care workers from right across the spectrum and has a special role for those who find themselves wounded and in exile space. The cracks in their lives, the cracks in our lives, are the gaps through which the light will shine. See, when you talk at the end, you can borrow from the beginning. So the metaphor of exile is one that most naturally fitted for me, and in a strange way, it made me more empathetic and I think accepted among steelworkers because I was vulnerable. They saw that when I played golf with them too. The very institutions that made the rules for their working lives, the CEO kings, were about to cut them loose. And soon the temple of their workplace, the coke ovens, the blast furnaces and the mills where they went daily to work for their sustenance would be demolished, leaving them in unwanted, demanding and scary seeking space. I just want to also mention some synergies that I feel with David Tacey. In my struggling and searching in those exile years, Tacey did two important things for me. First, he was one of the people who helped me to reorientate my own spiritual journey, giving me resources to approach the whole new set of questions that arise in the second half of life. Jung. His book, Edge of the Sacred, confirmed for me that the search for God is not so much out there or up there, but down here and in here. He pointed in directions that the institution was not indicating. and filled a gap in my spiritual experience that helped pave the way for all that followed. Ministry with steelworkers whose jobs were being made redundant, a parish teetering on the verge of institutional atrophy, and now here. He helped me to grow, to expand my vision, to do a little bit more of what Richard Rohr calls third eye seeing. The second thing that David Tacey inspired in me was looking for a way of working with secular, anti-institutional steelworkers hardened to and by life's knocks. People who, if their future was to amount to anything, desperately needed to find a sense of their own worth, their own spirituality, but you couldn't use that word, their own depth. Such was the impression he made on me that when I sought to formalise my learnings from Steelworks Chaplaincy, I included Tacey alongside Brueggemann and Bonhoeffer, primarily because the three of them work with this link between the sacred and the secular, and it's particularly applicable in an Australian context. This is exactly what my chaplaincy at the Steelworks was about. The steelworkers needed to find inner resources to take them on the next part of the journey, to take them through exile to their new home. With most of the props of work and income and mates and self-esteem stripped away, they had to find new life in and through the gap of joblessness. And I just want to share with you one story which came out of that inspiration that came from Tacey and others about one particular steelworker. Most of the people there would consider themselves as rational and non-religious people. And it might have appeared that they did not have spiritual resources to deal with the loss of their jobs. The story of Clive, that wasn't his name, is the story of a man who didn't only lose his job, but he lost his life. 12 months after the BHP closure, I was asked to conduct his funeral. Clive had formerly worked at the sinter plant. That's that part of the steelworks where the iron ore is blended with other materials such as limestone and coke before it goes into the blast furnace. Clive's job before he left the steelworks was as an ore blender. I'd spent a lot of time at his department due to industrial accidents, including an on-site fatality and the death of an employee while driving to work. Clive himself had died in a sudden and tragic accident while out for a social time with his wife and workmates. As his wife said, he was a man who no one would call religious. He was a bit rough and ready and spent a lot of his leisure time at the Western Suburbs Leagues Club. Yet he was a man who was loved by his friends and adored by his wife and 2 children. And at the funeral, I attempted to express for the congregation the underlying spirituality that I saw in this man and his workmates. And so I wrote this tribute to Clive and them. They paid daily homage in a towering cathedral of steel and concrete and corrugated iron. Communion was of the raucous crib room variety, breaking canteen bread. No wine allowed, of course. Every westerly wind baptized in russet dust. Each Remembrance Day, gathering so mates like Cookie and Jimmy Black would not be forgotten. Red Earth religion, Sinterplant spirituality. He pedalled in on the weekend for the love of the labour, blending the ore, a labour of love. Going west for the fellowship, calm, quiet friend in need. But deepest intimacy is at home. Annie, Damien, Amy, the dog, the bike, the pool. Now he's gone all the way home. Too bloody soon. And so to the Scriptures, what do they teach us about ministry in exile space? Life in exile is life without the usual props. For the Israelites, a void without king and temple. Nobody to order you around while at the same time providing benign and patronising protection. No structure within which you are directed as to where to find God and how to appease the divine in the face of one's shortcomings. The God of exile, if such a God exists, is indeed a God of the gaps. The lament in such a space, which also names the task, is how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And I've heard that refrain before in this conference too. So Jeremiah writes to the elders among the exiles who have been taken from Jerusalem, their Jerusalem home, to Babylon. Verse 4. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. God has sent them. Now, I'm not going to try and go deeply into the theology of that, but just to say that reminds us that in and through it all, however disconnected the people might feel, beneath are the everlasting arms. And in the end, it's all within the will and purpose of God. Verses 5 and 6. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. In other words, get on with life as if this was home. Fill this gap with normality. Live. Don't just go through the motions. Stay in the present. Don't pine for the long gone past or hope for a future that mirrors it. This part of the experience, properly lived and fully engaged in, is the making of a new and transformed future. Live where you are. Tacey and Lunig are two prophets who say that we need to seek the sacred in the secular. Exactly what Jeremiah is saying too. In Joseph's terms, we have to dwell in the place of seeking. And as I said to Joseph, a labyrinth is a good way to do that. And then verse 7, the surprise. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Don't just endure your lot. Don't just make the best of your own situation, but engage positively and creatively with the foreign community who are your new, if unwelcome and unwelcoming hosts. Seek the welfare of the city and pray for its welfare. Its welfare and yours are now one. I wonder how, for example, this would apply in situations of aged care. Many have left home involuntarily. I mean, how many people have you heard say, "Oh, I'm so looking forward to the time when I go into a nursing home"? Well, maybe there are a few, but I'm not one of them. How do you, like Jeremiah's elders, help such people to accept that this is now home? How can they find community in differentness, different food, different people around them, a strange and different bed, in a little room into which most of the accumulated treasures of a lifetime do not fit? Huge gaps everywhere. And you, the chaplain or pastoral care worker, may be the only one left with your finger in the dike holding back the waters of despair. One of the more distressing gaps that happens here is the one that grows in the space where memory once resided. Pastoral care worker Elaine Raper works in this space with people in the Mayflower village at Gerringong. She's found that giving a person a familiar object like a doll or showing them pictures of dogs and cats on her iPad opens up all sorts of interesting conversations and can put light back into dulled eyes. Someone else was just saying after the service that the different crosses that they wear sometimes attract the attention and are a gateway into conversation and spirituality. The elders among the Israelites carry the responsibility of giving the people structure and reassurance in the absence of all that once provided it. How do you do that in the exile space of your chaplaincy and pastoral care? Walter Brueggemann has much wisdom to offer about the journey of exile and the ways that lead to life. He talks about the need to enable and legitimize lament. Not always just patronizing people or jollying them along, because among other things, what carers are so often doing is helping people move through the process of loss and grief. And I very strongly share the view of Peter Pereira that it is that process more than anything else in all of our lives that can bring us to deeper spirituality. Yes, it can bring people to despair as well. We don't always see happy endings. But embracing grief is so critical in exile space. Learning how to sing the Lord's song in a strange land. As Brueggemann puts it, we need to relinquish in order to receive. Along with lament, which is not an end in itself, but part of a dynamic process, is the prophetic responsibility to energize the people by the articulation of hope. Brueggemann's words, energizing the people by the articulation of hope. Singing the Lord's song in a strange land until the strange place becomes more like home, or at least points towards it. According to Jeremiah, the elders of Israel, who accompany the people into the gap of exile, are responsible to carry the message of embracing reality, even as they themselves grieve, as elders, for elders and chaplains and pastoral care workers are people too. As chaplain, whether your place of work is the hospital or the jail or the aged care facility or wherever, you actually have to keep turning up until the place of exile feels like home, both for you and those for whom you care. Bear in mind that ultimately our message is that home is within us, and the sacred ground is where we walk day by day as the presence of God is revealed there. When you and I embody the gospel, people are helped to find themselves where they are in a deeper way. So the heavenly home is right where we are, and it is possible to dance in the gap in spite of it all. The elders of the Israeli exiles are called on to be strong, even in their own suffering, and lead the way through this new wilderness where all of the old landmarks are gone, but where God is still the God of abundance, who, as God did through the Exodus, feeds the journeying people with manna and quail. So how do we do it? Dance in the gap of lost and lonely lives in a way that brings healing and hope and a measure of fulfillment. As I move towards the end, I'm going to take just one verse from one of the other lectionary readings and offer it to you as a memory verse. Now I know this is old ways, memory verses. We learnt them at Sunday school. However, this one I think is worth remembering. Well, maybe they're all worth remembering. This one particularly. 2 Timothy. In 2 Timothy 1, verses 1 to 14, there is a verse 7. This is a letter where the writer, who is called Paul, reminds Timothy of the nature of his high calling and the 3 crucial gifts of God's Spirit that enable the servant of God to work in tough spaces. And this is the verse. For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. Okay, or depending what version you read. New Revised Standard Version, the real version. Okay. So I invite you, if you haven't already done so, to take that as a memory text, as I did 2 years ago. In the hurly-burly of the exile journey, there's not always time to go searching the scriptures for inspiration. It needs to be right there. God does not give us a spirit of cowardice. So what does cowardice look like in the ministry of the gaps? Perhaps it is sitting in a car for 6 hours, reading the newspaper and driving home. Embarrassing but human. But what is the gift of power, which I will call the gift of courage in this case? What does it look like? Perhaps it is when you stay alongside a guilty, grieving family who've got no one else to blame but the representative of God who did not fill the gap and they let their loved one die when they weren't visiting. Courage is staying there and not running home. Courage is walking in a gap with no handrails. Courage is facing acute discomfort in self and others, recognizing it in the moment and dealing with it later. From Joseph's notes, courage is the ability to tolerate ambiguity, to take responsibility, and to be differentiated. That's a big story, I'm not going there now. But to be willing to face doubt with what faith we have. And so the courage prayer of Michael Lunig is this: God help us if our world should grow dark and there is no way of seeing or knowing. Grant us courage and trust to touch and be touched, to find our way onwards by feeling. A spirit of love, so much that could be said, but in the spirit of this conference, let me again simply quote Michael Lunig. Love is born with a dark and troubled face. When hope is dead and in the most unlikely place, love is born. Love is always born. And the spirit of self-discipline? Not a popular word nowadays, even in the church. But it arises from the word disciple, discipline, learning. Whatever else discipline may mean, it means the ability to learn from experience, a process that requires disciplined reflection. Being here is part of the discipline, even though it's enjoyable. Being with your supervisor in an open and honest and vulnerable way, risking the gaps and understanding of why you just did what you did in that recent pastoral encounter, so that you can be helped to deeper understanding. Doing an ego angst inventory, perhaps. Discipline is recognizing that this work requires deep inner resources. Learning where to find them and how to integrate them so that we do not act out of our first reaction of the safety first urgings of the ego. The ego hates gaps, loves structure, safety, and predictability. The disciplined person recognizes their own ego needs and therefore places themselves in a position to choose right action even in the face of fear and entropy. I finish with a word of hope in the words of a hymn by Thomas Troger, which is a reflection on the scriptures of exile in Isaiah. And this is what he says. Gangling desert birds will sing, jackals too will join God's choir, rivers out of rock will spring, paths will cut through thorn and briar. In the wilderness of sand, God will lead us by the hand. Here and now, in clear, plain view, God is doing something new. In this strange and foreign land, God in unexpected ways will do miracles as grand as the ancient deeds you praise. God who pushed aside the sea still redeems and sets us free. Here and now, in clear, plain view, God is doing something new. While the exiles far from home watched their captors' muddy streams pass between flat banks of loam, Zion's rivers filled their dreams, till Isaiah's words of grace thundered through that pagan place. Here and now, in plain view, clear plain view, God is doing something new. And the last verse I offer as our prayer. Lord, alert our eyes to prove with Isaiah's deeper sight, where today upon this globe you are sowing deeds of light. Erase our yearnings for the past till we see by faith at last, here and now, in clear, plain view, God is doing something new. Thank you.